The Golden Trap. The van sat dark and silent on the suburban street, its three occupants watching the modest two-story house through the gathering dusk. Snake, a wiry man with nervous hands that couldn't stop fiddling with his knife, peered through binoculars at the well-maintained property. Something about the house made his skin crawl, though he couldn't explain why. Maybe it was the way the shadows seemed to move oddly around the windows, or how the garden's rose bushes reminded him of grasping claws in the dim light. 2 weeks of surveillance and they're like clockwork, Razor said, his voice carrying the authority of a natural leader. Lights out by 9, same routine every night. He ran a hand through his close-cropped hair, trying to shake off an inexplicable sense of unease. Brick, built like his namesake, shifted his massive frame in the passenger seat. The leather creaked ominously in the silence. "You sure about this intel, boss?" That much gold in a residential workshop seems too good to be true. He'd done dozens of home invasions before, but something felt different this time. Wrong. "My source is solid," Razor replied, though his voice held a trace of doubt. "The old man's been crafting custom jewelry for 50 years. High-end clients, all cash business. They're sitting on millions in raw materials and finished pieces." What none of them knew was that they weren't the first crew to target this house. They were just the latest in a long line that had mysteriously disappeared over the years. Inside the house, Martha sat in her favorite armchair, knitting needles, clicking softly in the darkness, like tiny bones rattling together. Her husband Gerald occupied the leather recliner nearby, reading a well-worn copy of a book whose title was written in a language few living people could read. The basement below them held secrets far darker than mere jewelry. "They're here," Martha said without looking up from her work. Her eyes, when she finally raised them, held an unnatural gleam in the darkness. "Young ones, full of life, perfect for our needs." Gerald carefully marked his place in the book and set it aside. "Right on schedule. The moon is perfect tonight." His weathered hands weren't just marked by decades of metalwork. Strange symbols had been carved into the flesh years ago, symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. At the back door, Snake made quick work of the lock while Brick and Razor kept watch. The door swung open with barely a whisper, and the three men slipped inside. None of them noticed the subtle markings etched into the doorframe, nor how their reflections in the windows seemed to move independently for just a moment. "Workshop's in the basement," Razor breathed, his voice barely audible. "In and out in 5 minutes. No need to even bother with the old-timers upstairs." They moved through the kitchen like shadows, their flashlight beams dancing across family photos where the subject's eyes seemed to follow their movement. Everything about the house screamed elderly couple, the pill organizer on the counter, the large print magazine left open on the table, the subtle smell of mothballs, and something metallic that Snake's brain refused to identify as dried blood. Snake reached for the basement door handle, and that's when everything went wrong. Brilliant lights flooded the house, but instead of the white glare they expected, the light held a sickly, greenish tinge that made their skin look corpse-like. The sound of metal shutters slamming down over every window and door echoed through the house like the lid of a coffin closing. "Welcome, gentlemen." Martha's voice came through hidden speakers, but it had changed, deeper, older somehow, as if multiple voices were speaking in unison. "We've been expecting you." Before any of them could react, a fine mist began spraying from concealed nozzles in the ceiling. Snake made it 2 steps toward the back door before his knees buckled. As he fell, he caught a glimpse of something moving in the shadows, something that shouldn't have been able to fit in those shadows at all. Brick managed to draw his gun, but couldn't keep it steady enough to aim. The last thing he saw before consciousness faded was Martha standing at the top of the stairs, her form seeming to shift and grow in impossible ways. Razor lasted the longest, fighting against the sedative even as his vision blurred. He watched in horror as Gerald approached, the old man's shadow stretching across the wall like a massive twisted thing with too many limbs. "What? Are you?" were his last words before darkness claimed him. Consciousness returned slowly, accompanied by pounding headaches and the horrifying realization that they were secured to ancient stone slabs, not chairs as they'd first thought. The basement workshop around them was a nightmare of contradictions. Modern jewelry-making equipment mixed with artifacts that looked centuries old. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling alongside things that definitely weren't plants. The walls were covered in symbols that hurt their eyes if they looked at them too long. Gerald sat at his workbench, carefully examining what looked like a human bone through a jeweler's loop, while Martha arranged various implements on a rolling tray. Some were modern surgical tools. Others looked like they'd been forged in humanity's darker ages. "You know," Martha said conversationally, "humans are such fascinating creatures, so full of energy, of life force." She picked up something that might once have been a jeweler's tool before it was twisted into a new purpose. "We've found so many uses for that energy over the centuries." "Centuries?" Snake whimpered, finally noticing that Martha's shadow didn't match her form at all. Gerald turned around, his eyes now an impossible shade of amber. "Did you really think we chose jewelry making by accident? Gold isn't the only thing that can be shaped and transformed by skilled hands." He held up a ring that seemed to be moving on its own. "Though we do enjoy working with precious metals, too. They make such excellent conduits." "Listen," Razor began, his training useless in the face of what he was seeing. "Whatever you want—" "Oh, we want quite a lot," Martha smiled, her teeth suddenly too numerous and sharp to be human. "You see, immortality requires regular maintenance, and you three—" She inhaled deeply. "You three have such wonderful potential?" "The last group barely lasted a month," Gerald said sadly, reaching for tools that began to glow with an eldritch light. "Let's hope you prove more resilient." "Now then," Martha said, her form stretching and shifting as she moved closer. "Who would like to go first?" The process is quite fascinating, though I'm afraid none of our previous subjects remained sane long enough to appreciate it fully. The basement workshop, warded and soundproofed by powers older than civilization, absorbed their screams like a hungry thing. The symbols on the walls pulsed with new energy as ancient rituals began again. Upstairs, the house remained quiet and peaceful, its ordinary exterior giving no hint of the horrors unfolding below. Just another quiet night in suburbia, where some predators are far older and more terrible than any human criminal could imagine. After all, retirement doesn't mean what it used to, especially when you've never been human to begin with.